The morning after we buried my husband Frank, his sister Judith stood in my living room with two police officers and said the words that shattered my world. "Pack your things, Veronica. This house was never yours." I stood there in my black funeral dress, the same one I'd worn just yesterday when we lowered Frank into the ground, and felt the room spin around me. The officers flanked Judith like bodyguards, their hands resting on their duty belts, while she stood there in her designer suit looking at me like I was a squatter in my own home. "What are you talking about?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. 28 years of marriage, 28 years in this house, and she was standing here telling me it wasn't mine? Judith stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors that Frank and I had refinished ourselves 10 years ago. This house belongs to the Hartley Family Trust. Frank was merely a beneficiary with lifetime occupancy rights. Now that he's deceased, the property reverts to the blood relatives named in the trust. That would be myself and Dennis. Dennis, Frank's younger brother, stood behind her, unable to meet my eyes. He'd been at the funeral yesterday, hugging me, telling me how sorry he was, calling me his sister. Now he was here to throw me out of my home. "There must be some mistake," I said, gripping the back of the sofa where Frank used to sit every evening, reading his history journals while I worked on my flower arrangements. "Frank told me his parents left him this house when they died. We've been paying the property taxes, the maintenance, everything for almost 3 decades. "Yes, you've been maintaining our family property quite nicely," Judith replied with a smile that never reached her eyes. "We appreciate that, but maintaining a property doesn't make you the owner. Frank knew the terms of the trust. I find it interesting he never mentioned it to you." Officer Martinez, the taller of the two policemen, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we're here to supervise the eviction. The paperwork has been filed with the court. You have 72 hours to collect your personal belongings and vacate the premises." "Eviction? You're evicting me from my home 3 days after my husband's funeral?" "It's not your home," Judith repeated slowly, as if I were a child who couldn't understand simple concepts. "It never was. You were simply a guest here by virtue of your marriage to Frank. That marriage ended with his death." My legs felt weak. I reached for the wall to steady myself, my hand landing on our wedding photo, the one where Frank and I stood on the front porch of this very house, both of us glowing with joy. He'd carried me over the threshold that day, whispering that this would be our forever home. "My children grew up here," I said, my voice growing stronger with indignation. "Melody took her first steps in that hallway. Christopher broke his arm falling from the oak tree in the backyard. This is their childhood home. Your children are welcome to visit," Dennis finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "But the trust is clear. Only Hartley blood inherits. Spouses are excluded." Roger, Judith's husband, emerged from the kitchen holding a clipboard. I realized with horror that they'd already been walking through my home, cataloging it like vultures over a carcass. "We'll need an inventory of what belongs to you personally versus what belongs to the estate," he said matter-of-factly. "The furniture, for instance, was purchased by Frank's parents, so that stays. We bought new furniture together. I have receipts." "Then you can take those pieces," Judith conceded magnanimously. "We're not unreasonable, Veronica. Just practical. This is a family asset worth over $800,000. Surely you understand we can't simply let it pass outside the bloodline." The room felt like it was closing in on me. Every corner held a memory. The kitchen where I taught Melody to bake, the stairs where we'd photographed the kids in their prom outfits, the dining room where we'd hosted 28 Thanksgivings. Frank's reading glasses still sat on the side table, right where he'd left them 4 days ago, before clutching his chest and falling to the floor. "Please," I heard myself begging, hating how weak I sounded. "I just lost my husband. Can't we discuss this after I've had time to grieve, to understand what's happening?" "The law doesn't pause for grief," Judith said, checking her watch as if I was wasting her valuable time. "Officer Martinez will explain the eviction process. We'll be back in 72 hours. If you're not out, you'll be removed forcibly." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Veronica, the garden you planted? It's increased the property value considerably. We'll be sure to maintain it properly." That's when something inside me snapped. but I held my tongue. Because somewhere deep in my heart, I knew Frank. He would never have left me this vulnerable. Never. I'm Veronica, and for 28 years, I thought I knew everything about my husband, Frank. We met when I was 24, fresh out of college with a degree I wasn't using and a passion for flowers that my father called impractical. I just started my first real job at Rosewood Florals, and we got a last-minute order for an elaborate birthday arrangement. The customer was particular, wanting purple irises mixed with white roses, baby's breath, and exactly 3 stems of lavender. When I delivered it to the sprawling Hartley estate on the outskirts of town, Frank answered the door. He was different from the men I'd dated before, quieter, more thoughtful. While his mother gushed over the arrangement, he asked me about the meaning behind each flower I'd chosen. That conversation stretched for an hour, and by the time I left, he had my number written on the back of his museum business card. Frank worked as a curator at the Grayson Historical Museum downtown, specializing in preserving local history. It wasn't glamorous work, and his family never let him forget it. His sister Judith had married Roger, a paralegal who acted like he ran a Fortune 500 company. His brother Dennis had gone into real estate development, turning farmland into strip malls and calling it progress. But Frank loved his quiet life among the artifacts and stories of the past. We married 2 years after that first meeting, in a small ceremony in the garden behind what Frank told me was his house. His parents had died 5 years before we met, he said, leaving him the Victorian property on Maple Street. It needed work, but Frank promised we'd make it our own. And we did, pouring every spare penny and weekend into restoring its original beauty. Our daughter Melody came along 3 years later, born during a spring thunderstorm that knocked out power to half the city. Christopher followed 2 years after that, arriving so quickly that Frank had to deliver him in our bedroom with the help of a very calm 911 operator. We were a team, Frank and I, building our life board by board, flower by flower, memory by memory. The house became our canvas. I planted gardens that would bloom in succession from March through November, ensuring something was always flowering. Frank built bookcases in every room, filling them with histories and biographies he'd read to the children every night. The kitchen became my laboratory where I experimented with recipes, and Frank's study became his sanctuary where he wrote articles for historical journals that paid almost nothing but made him proud. We weren't wealthy, not by Judith and Dennis's standards. Frank's salary from the museum was modest, and my flower shop, which I'd opened after saving for 10 years, made enough to cover extras and college savings. But we were rich in ways that mattered. Sunday dinners with the whole family crowded around our table, even if Judith complained about my cooking. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the living room floor while Frank played his father's old records. The garden parties where I taught neighborhood children how to plant seeds and watch them grow. Frank was diagnosed with high blood pressure 5 years ago, but he took his medication religiously and seemed fine. He'd started taking longer walks, eating better, even cut back on the coffee he loved. He talked about retirement, about traveling to see the historical sites he'd only read about. We were planning a trip to Greece for our 30th anniversary. Then 4 days ago, I was in the shop working on a wedding order when my assistant Teresa answered the phone. Her face went white as she handed it to me. It was Christopher, barely able to speak through his tears. Frank had collapsed at the museum. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. A massive heart attack, they said. He probably didn't suffer, they said, as if that made it easier. Melody flew in from Boston, where she was in her 3rd year of medical school. She kept saying if she'd been there, if she'd known more, maybe she could have saved him. Christopher drove straight through from Colorado, arriving with red eyes and 3 days of stubble. They held me up during the funeral, one on each side, as we said goodbye to the man who had been our foundation. The house felt empty without Frank, but it still felt like home. His coffee mug sat by the kitchen sink. His bookmark peeked out of the biography he'd never finish. His slippers waited by his side of the bed. I thought I'd have time to grieve surrounded by these remnants of our life together. I was wrong. 3 days after we buried him, his siblings came to claim what they insisted was theirs, armed with documents and police officers, and a cruelty I never knew they possessed. They stood in my living room. The the room where Frank had proposed to me on a random Tuesday because he couldn't wait another day, and told me that everything I believed about my life had been a beautiful lie. That morning, Judith arrived with her husband, Roger, and Frank's brother, Dennis, at exactly 9 o'clock. I was in Frank's study sorting through his papers, trying to find his life insurance documents when I heard the doorbell. Not a knock, but the doorbell, pressed repeatedly like someone announcing bad news. When I opened the door, Judith pushed past me without invitation, her perfume filling the foyer with a scent that made me nauseous. Roger followed with a leather briefcase, and Dennis slunk in behind them, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Veronica, we need to discuss the house," Judith announced, walking into my living room as if she owned it. "What about it?" I asked, confused by their formal tone and the briefcase Roger was already opening on my coffee table. "This house belongs to the Hartley Family Trust," Judith said, pulling off her gloves, finger by finger. "Frank was just a beneficiary, allowed to live here during his lifetime. Now that he's gone, it reverts to us, his blood relatives." The words didn't make sense. I sat down hard on the arm of Frank's chair, the one where he'd read every evening. "That's impossible. Frank told me his parents left this house to him. We've paid the property taxes for 28 years. We have the receipts filed in that very cabinet." Dennis finally looked up, pulling a thick folder from Roger's briefcase. "Frank was never the owner, Veronica. Here's the trust documentation from 1978. He spread papers across my coffee table, legal documents with raised seals and signatures I recognized as Frank's parents. Father set it up so the house would stay in the Hartley bloodline. Frank knew this. But I'm his wife. We have children together. They're Hartleys too." "You were his wife," Judith corrected, emphasizing the past tense with cruel precision. "And your children can visit, but they don't inherit. The trust specifies that only Hartley blood inherits. And the trustee positions pass to siblings first. That's Dennis and me." Roger, who had been silent until now, pulled out more papers. "We've already filed the eviction notice with the county court. Judge Williamson signed it this morning. You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings." My hands started shaking. "You filed for eviction before even talking to me. Frank's been dead for 3 days." "We filed the moment we received the death certificate," Judith said matter-of-factly. "This is a valuable property, Veronica. We can't have it tied up in some prolonged dispute." I called Melody right there in front of them, my fingers trembling as I dialed. She answered on the second ring. "Mom, how are you holding up?" "Melody, your aunt and uncle are here. They're saying the house isn't ours, that it belongs to some trust." "What? That's insane. Dad always said that house would be ours. He promised Christopher and me when we were kids that we'd inherit it." Judith took the phone from my hand. "Melody, dear, your father made promises he couldn't keep. The law is the law." She handed the phone back to me while my daughter shouted questions I couldn't answer. By noon, 2 police officers had arrived with the official eviction order. Officer Martinez, whom I recognized from the neighborhood watch meetings Frank used to attend, looked deeply uncomfortable as he explained the situation. "Ma'am, the paperwork appears legitimate. The trust names Judith and Dennis Hartley as successor trustees with full rights to the property upon Frank's death." "But where am I supposed to go?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. "That's not our concern," Judith interjected. "You've had 28 years of free housing. Consider it a generous gift." "Free housing? I paid for every repair, every improvement. I installed the new heating system. I renovated the kitchen with my mother's inheritance money." "Then you should have kept receipts," Roger said, "though improvements to trust property generally become part of the trust asset." My mother, Dolly, arrived within an hour, having broken speed limits across town. At 78, she was 5 feet of pure indignation. "This is criminal," she shouted at Judith, waving her cane for emphasis. "Veronica nursed your mother through cancer in this house. She held that woman's hand when she died in the upstairs bedroom, and this is how you repay her?" "Mother Hartley was grateful," Judith replied smoothly, unmoved by my mother's fury. "But gratitude doesn't override legal documents. If Frank wanted to ensure Veronica's security, he should have made other arrangements." Dennis spoke up weakly. "We're not monsters, Veronica. You can take your clothes, your personal items, anything you can prove you purchased independently." "How generous," I spat, finding my voice finally. I can keep my own belongings. Should I be grateful? Christopher arrived that evening, having driven 14 hours straight from Colorado. His park ranger uniform was wrinkled, his face haggard with grief and now rage. "How can you do this?" he demanded, confronting Dennis in the driveway. "You held me as a baby. You taught me to ride a bike in this driveway." "Business is business, Chris," Dennis replied, not meeting his nephew's eyes. "Your father knew the rules." With nowhere else to go, I moved into my mother's cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. The contrast was jarring. From a 4-bedroom Victorian with a wraparound porch to a second-floor walk-up where the neighbors' arguments came through the thin walls and the kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people. My mother gave me her bedroom, insisting on sleeping on the pull-out couch despite my protests. Melody wanted to drop out of medical school immediately. "I can get loans, Mom. I'll come home and help you fight this." But I refused to let Frank's death derail her dreams. He'd been so proud when she got into Boston University, telling everyone at the museum about his daughter, the future doctor. I wouldn't let Judith and Dennis take that too. Christopher flew back from Colorado 3 days later, having arranged emergency leave from the Park Service. He was furious in a way I'd never seen him, his usually gentle nature replaced by raw anger. He drove straight to Dennis's real estate office downtown and confronted him in front of his entire staff. "Uncle Dennis, how could you do this to Mom?" Christopher's voice carried through the glass windows. "Dad trusted you. He named you as my godfather." "Business is business, Chris. Your father knew the rules. He should have prepared better." "Prepared better? He died at 55. He thought he had time." But Dennis just shuffled papers on his desk and had security escort Christopher out. Something felt wrong about all of this, beyond just the cruelty of the timing. Frank was meticulous about everything. He kept detailed records of historical artifacts that were centuries old. He labeled everything in our house, had files for every major purchase, every document. How could he not tell me about something this important? How could he let me renovate the kitchen, plant the gardens, pour my inheritance into a house that wasn't even ours? I started going through the boxes I'd managed to pack, the few papers from Frank's study that I'd grabbed in my haste. Most of it was museum work, research notes, correspondence with other historians. But in a folder marked personal, I found something odd. 5 years' worth of correspondence with someone named Harrison Blackwood, Esquire, with an address in the next state. The letters were brief, mostly confirming appointments and referencing the matter we discussed. My mother was washing dishes when I showed her the letters. Why would Frank have a lawyer I didn't know about? She dried her hands slowly, thinking. Maybe he was planning something. Your husband wasn't a fool, Veronica. He knew what his family was capable of. I found Mr. Blackwood's number and called from my mother's landline, my cell phone having been disconnected when I couldn't access Frank's accounts to pay the bill. A pleasant secretary answered on the second ring. "Blackwood and Associates. How may I help you?" "This is Veronica Hartley. I found your correspondence with my late husband, Frank Hartley." There was a pause. "Oh, Mrs. Hartley, Mr. Blackwood has been trying to reach you. He has urgent documents regarding your husband's estate. He tried calling your home, but the number was disconnected. His siblings took the house." "What estate? They say Frank owned nothing." "Ma'am, I think you need to come to our office immediately. Can you come tomorrow?" The drive took 3 hours. My mother insisted on coming, bringing a thermos of coffee and sandwiches, like we were going on a road trip instead of possibly chasing false hope. The law office was in an old building downtown, all dark wood and leather chairs that spoke of old money and older secrets. Harrison Blackwood was in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stood when we entered, taking my hands in both of his. "Mrs. Hartley, I'm so sorry for your loss. Frank was a good man and a smart one. Please sit down. We have much to discuss." He poured us tea from a silver service, his movements deliberate and calm. "Your husband has been my client for 15 years. He came to me originally with concerns about his family trust and his siblings' behavior." 15 years? But that was before his parents died. "Yes. Frank discovered some irregularities in how his siblings were handling his parents' finances during their final years. He suspected they might try something like this when he passed, so he took precautions." What kind of precautions? My mother leaned forward, gripping her purse. Blackwood smiled, a lawyer's smile that suggested he was about to reveal a winning hand. The kind that would make his siblings very unhappy if they knew. Frank was playing a long game, Mrs. Hartley. He knew exactly what he was doing. He walked to a large safe in the corner, spinning the combination with practiced ease. Frank updated his instructions just 3 months ago, right after his last cardiac event. He said, and I quote, "If my siblings show their true colors, give Veronica everything. They've already taken enough." Mr. Blackwood opened the safe and pulled out a thick envelope marked in Frank's careful handwriting. "To be opened only upon my death, Franklin James Hartley." The lawyer also retrieved several folders, a small wooden box, and what looked like original photographs from decades past. "Your husband discovered something about the family trust that his siblings don't know," Blackwood began, adjusting his glasses as he spread documents across his mahogany desk. "The original trust has a clause that Frank's father insisted on, probably never imagining his own. Children would trigger it. If any trustee commits fraud or uses trust property for personal gain, without unanimous consent of all beneficiaries, they forfeit all rights to the trust permanently." He showed me a series of photographs and documents, each one carefully labeled with dates and descriptions in Frank's handwriting. 15 years ago, Frank discovered that Judith had been secretly renting out the guest house on the property to traveling nurses from the hospital. She was collecting $1,200 a month and never declaring it to the trust or sharing it with Frank. Here are copies of 7 years of lease agreements she signed, deposit slips into her personal account, even text messages between her and Roger discussing how to hide the income. My mother gasped. She was stealing from the trust while Frank was living there? "That's just the beginning," Blackwood continued, pulling out another folder. "Dennis was using the house address to secure business loans for his real estate ventures, claiming it as collateral he owned. He took out 3 different loans, totaling $2 million, fraudulently representing himself as the sole owner of the property. Each loan application is a separate count of fraud." The room felt like it was spinning. Frank had known all of this and never said a word to me, never confronted his siblings, never showed anger about their betrayal. "But there's more," Blackwood said, his eyes twinkling with what I can only describe as professional satisfaction. Frank didn't just document their fraud, he took action. There was a distant cousin, Gregory Hartley, who had a potential future interest in the trust. Essentially, if all primary beneficiaries were disqualified, Gregory's descendants could make a claim. Frank tracked Gregory down in Arizona and purchased his reverter claim for $50,000. Here's the signed and notarized transfer document. He placed a legal document in front of me, complete with official seals and witness signatures. With Judith and Dennis disqualified due to fraud, and Frank holding Gregory's reversionary interest, Frank became the sole eligible trustee. Unlike his siblings, who were merely beneficiaries, he had the legal authority to dissolve the trust entirely. "He could end the trust?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "He did end it." Blackwood smiled, pulling out the largest document. 3 months ago, when Frank learned his heart condition was worse than he'd let on, he executed this. He dissolved the Hartley family trust and transferred the house into an irrevocable living trust with you, Veronica Hartley, as the sole beneficiary. The documents were filed with the county recorder's office but not yet updated in the public database. Government bureaucracy at its finest, actually working in our favor for once. He handed me an official deed with a gold seal. My name was there in bold letters. Veronica Marie Hartley, trustee and sole beneficiary of the IE Franklin James Hartley Living Trust. "The house your in-laws kicked you out of?" Blackwood leaned back in his chair. "You've owned it outright for 3 months. They just didn't know it." "But why didn't Frank tell me?" I felt tears streaming down my face, a mix of relief and confusion and anger that he'd kept this secret. "He left this letter to explain," Blackwood said gently, handing me an envelope with my name written in Frank's familiar script. I opened it with shaking hands and read aloud, "My darling Veronica, if you're reading this, it means they've shown their true colors. I'm sorry for the deception, but I knew they'd contest everything if they knew while I was sick. They would have made my final months miserable with legal battles and family warfare. I wanted our last days together to be peaceful, filled with love, not lawyers. Let them think they've won first. Let them show the world who they really are. The law is on your side. Mr. Blackwood has everything you need. All my love, Frank. P.S. Check the garden shed. 3rd floorboard from the door. I left something for the kids. My mother stood up, her face flushed with triumph. That brilliant, wonderful man. He knew exactly what they'd do, and he let them hang themselves with their own rope. Blackwood nodded. Frank spent years building this case. Every document is authenticated. Every piece of evidence is admissible. Your husband was thorough, Mrs. Hartley. He protected you in death in a way his siblings never expected. So the eviction notice they filed, I asked, hope rising in my chest. Completely invalid. They filed to evict you from your own property. In fact, they're the ones trespassing. They broke into your house, changed your locks, and have been living there illegally for the past week. The next morning, I returned to the house with Mr. Blackwood, a locksmith, and 2 police officers. The same Officer Martinez who had escorted me out a week earlier now stood beside me as we rang the doorbell of my own home. Judith answered the door wearing my grandmother's silk robe, the one Frank's mother had given me for our 10th anniversary. "What are you doing here?" she snarled, her face contorting with rage. Mr. Blackwood stepped forward and served her the papers with professional calm. "Mrs. Brennan, you're trespassing on Mrs. Hartley's property. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises or you'll be arrested." The look on her face was priceless. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. "This is impossible. We own this house. The trust clearly states that blood relatives inherit." "The trust you're referring to was legally dissolved 3 months ago," Blackwood explained patiently. "Additionally, you and your brother Dennis have been disqualified as beneficiaries due to fraud. Here's the documentation of your illegal rental income from the guest house and your brother's fraudulent loan applications using this property as collateral." Dennis arrived within minutes, screeching his Mercedes to a halt in the driveway. He stormed up the porch steps, shouting about lawsuits and contested documents, but Blackwood had done everything perfectly. Their own greed and fraud had destroyed any claim they might have had. "How does it feel?" Judith hissed at me as Officer Martinez supervised her packing. "Happy now? You've torn this family apart." "I didn't tear anything," I replied calmly. "You did that yourself when you tried to steal from your brother's widow 3 days after his funeral. Frank knew exactly who you were. That's why he protected his real family from you." They left with only their clothes and personal items, the same restriction they'd placed on me. Roger tried to take some of the antique furniture, claiming it was Judith's inheritance, but I had receipts for everything Frank and I had purchased over the years. The furniture they thought belonged to Frank's parents? We'd bought it at estate sales, Frank carefully choosing pieces that matched the house's Victorian character. After they left, Christopher and Melody joined me in the garden. Together, we went to the shed and pried up the 3rd floorboard from the door. Underneath was a metal box containing $200,000 in bonds and a note in Frank's handwriting, "For Melody and Christopher's futures. Tell them their father loved them enough to fight the dragons, even from beyond. Use this for your dreams, not your sorrows." Melody broke down crying. "He knew he was sick, didn't he? Worse than he told us?" "He wanted to protect us," Christopher said, holding his sister, "just like he always did." 6 months later, I received one more surprise. Frank had been paying premiums on a life insurance policy I never knew existed, one that paid out double for sudden cardiac death. The beneficiary was an education trust for our children that Judith and Dennis could never touch. $500,000 to ensure Melody could finish medical school and Christopher could pursue his dream of becoming a wildlife conservationist. I learned that Frank had spent years quietly protecting us from his family's greed. Every document, every secret meeting with Mr. Blackwood, every piece of evidence he gathered was an act of love. He knew his siblings would circle like vultures the moment he died, so he set a trap that would spring only after they revealed their true nature to the world. The guest house Judith had been secretly renting now houses my mother, who tends the garden with the dedication of someone who knows what it means to almost lose everything. Dennis's real estate business collapsed when news of his fraud spread through the business community. Nobody wanted to deal with someone who would steal from his own brother's widow. Judith moved to Florida, where Roger left her 6 months later for a younger woman who, ironically, was after his money. I run my flower shop from the sunroom now, the one that gets perfect. Morning light. Customers love picking up their arrangements from the Victorian house with the beautiful gardens. I tell them about the flowers, about how each one has meaning, just like Frank first asked me all those years ago. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet satisfaction of a man who loved his family enough to play the long game, who knew that truth has a way of blooming if you plant the right seeds. Frank always said he was preserving history for future generations. Turns out he was preserving our future too. Every Sunday, I still bake banana bread using his mother's recipe. The kitchen still smells like cinnamon and vanilla, like love and victory combined. And somewhere, I know Frank is smiling, knowing his family is exactly where we belong, home. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that justice sometimes comes to those who wait. Leave a comment below about a time when someone you loved protected you in ways you didn't expect. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, loss, and triumph. Thank you for listening to my story.